Section 1 of Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Government and Society. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeffrey Church. Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Government and Society by Thomas Hobbes. The Epistle Dedicatory. To the Right Honourable William Earl of Devonshire, my most honoured lord. May it please your lordship. It was the speech of the Roman people, to whom the name king had been rendered odious, as well by the tyranny of the Tarquins as by the genius and decretals of that city. It was the speech, I say, of the public, however pronounced from a private mouth, if yet Cato the censor were no more than such, that all kings are to be reckoned amongst ravenous beasts. But what a beast of prey was the Roman people, whilst with its conquering eagles it erected its proud trophies so far and wide over the world, bringing the Africans, the Asiatics, the Macedonians, and the Achaeans, with many other despoiled nations, into a specious bondage, with the pretence of preferring them to the denizens of Rome. So that if Cato's saying were a wise one, it was every whit as wise, that of Pontius Tilicinus, who flying about with open mouth through all the companies of his army in that famous encounter which he had with Sylla, cried out, that Rome herself, as well as Sylla, was to be razed, for that there would always be wolves and depredators of their liberty, unless the forest that lodged them were grubbed up by the roots. To speak impartially, both sayings are very true, that man to man is a kind of God, and that man to man is an arrant wolf. The first is true if we compare citizens amongst themselves, and the second if we compare cities. In the one, there is some analogy of similitude with the deity, to wit, justice and charity, the twin sisters of peace. But in the other, good men must defend themselves by taking to them for sanctuary the two daughters of war, deceit and violence. Then in plain terms a mere brutal rapacity, which although men object to one another as a reproach, by an inbred custom which they have of beholding their own actions in the persons of other men, wherein, as in a mirror, all things on the left side appear to be on the right, and all things on the right side to be as plainly on the left. Yet the natural right of preservation which we all receive from the uncontrollable dictates of necessity will not admit it to be a vice, though it confess it to be an unhappiness. Now that with Cato himself, a person of so great a renown for wisdom, animosity should so prevail instead of judgment, and partiality instead of reason, that the very same thing which he thought equal in his popular state, he should censure as unjust in a monarchical, other men perhaps may have leisure to admire. But I have long since of this opinion, that there never was yet any more than vulgar prudence, that had the luck of being acceptable to the giddy people. But either it hath not been understood, or else having been so hath been levelled and cried down. The more eminent actions and apothegms, both of the Greeks and Romans, have been indebted for their eulogies not so much to the reason, as to the greatness of them, and very many times to that prosperous usurpation, with which our histories do so mutually upbraid each other, which as a conquering torrent carries all before it, as well public agents as public actions in the stream of time. Wisdom, properly so called, is nothing else but this, the perfect knowledge of the truth in all matters whatsoever, which being derived from the registers and records of things, and that as it were through the conduit of certain definite appellations, cannot possibly be the work of a sudden acuteness, but of a well-balanced reason, which by the compendium of a word we call philosophy. For by this it is that a way is opened to us, in which we travel from the contemplation of particular things to the inference or result of universal actions. Now look how many sorts of things there are, which properly fall within the cognizance of human reason. Into so many branches does the tree of philosophy divide itself. And from the diversity of the matter about which they are conversant, there hath been given to those branches a diversity of names too. For treating of figures, it is called geometry, of motion, physic, of natural right, morals. Put all together, they make up philosophy. Just as the British, the Atlantic, and the Indian seas being diversely christened from the diversity of their shores, do notwithstanding all together make up the ocean. And truly the geometricians have very admirably performed their part. For whatsoever assistance doth accrue to the life of man, whether from the observation of the heavens, or from the description of the earth, from the notation of times, or from the remotest experiments with navigation, finally, whatsoever things they are in which this present age doth differ from the rude simpleness of antiquity, we must acknowledge to be a debt which we owe merely to geometry. If the moral philosophers had as happily discharged their duty, I know not what could have been added by human industry to the completion of that happiness which is consistent with human life. For were the nature of human actions as distinctly known as the nature of quantity in geometrical figures, the strength of avarice and ambition, which is sustained by the erroneous opinions of the vulgar as touching the nature of right and wrong, would presently faint and languish, and mankind should enjoy such an immortal peace, that unless it were for habitation, on supposition that the earth should grow too narrow for her inhabitants, there would hardly be left any pretence for war. But now, on the contrary, that neither the sword nor the pen should be allowed any cessation, that the knowledge of the law of nature should lose its growth, not advancing a whit beyond its ancient stature, that there should still be such siding with the several factions of philosophers, that the very same action should be decried by some, and as much elevated by others, that the very same man should at several times embrace his several opinions, and esteem his own actions far otherwise in himself than he does in others. These, I say, are so many signs, so many manifest arguments, that what hath hitherto been written by moral philosophers hath not made any progress in the knowledge of the truth, but yet hath took with the world, not so much by giving any light to the understanding as entertainment to the affections, whilst by the successful rhetorications of their speech they have confirmed them in their rashly received opinions. So that this part of philosophy hath suffered the same destiny with the public ways, which lie open to all passengers to traverse up and down, or the same lot with highways and open streets, some for divertisement, and some for business, so that what with the impertinences of some and the altercations of others, those ways have never a seed time, and therefore yield never a harvest. The only reason of which unluckiness should seem to be this, that amongst all the writers of that part of philosophy, there is not one that hath used an idoneous principle of tractation. For we may not, as in a circle, begin the handling of a science from what point we please. There is a certain clue of reason whose beginning is in the dark, but by the benefit of whose conduct we are led as it were by the hand into the clearest light, so that the principle of tractation is to be taken from that darkness, and then the light to be carried thither but for irradiating the doubts. As often, therefore, as any writer doth either weakly forsake that clue, or wilfully cut it asunder, he describes the footsteps, not of his progress in science, but of his wanderings from it. And from this it was, that when I applied my thoughts to the investigation of natural justice, I was presently advertised from the very word justice, which signifies a steady will of giving every one his own, that my first inquiry was to be, from whence it proceeded that any man should call anything rather his own than another man's. And when I found that this proceeded not from nature but consent, for what nature had first laid forth in common, men did afterwards distribute into several impropriations, I was conducted from thence to another inquiry, namely, to what end and upon what impulsives, when all was equally every man's in common, men did rather think it fitting that every man should have his enclosure. And I found the reason was, that from a community of goods there must needs arise contention, whose enjoyment should be greatest. And from that contention all kinds of calamities must unavoidably ensue, which by the instinct of nature every man is taught to shun. Having therefore thus arrived at two maxims of human nature, the one arising from the concupiscible part, which desires to appropriate to himself the use of those things in which all others have a joint interest, the other proceeding from the rational, which teaches every man to fly contra natural disillusion, as the greatest mischief that can arrive to nature, Which principles being laid down, I seem from them to have demonstrated by a most evident connection, in this little work of mine, first, the absolute necessity of leagues and contracts, and thence the rudiments both of moral and of civil prudence. That appendage which is added concerning the regimen of God, hath been done with this intent, that the dictates of God Almighty and the law of nature might not seem repugnant to the written law, revealed to us in his word. I have also been very wary in the whole tenor of my discourse, not to meddle with the civil laws of any particular nation whatsoever. That is to say, I have avoided coming ashore, which those times have so invested both with shelves and tempests. At what expense of time and industry I have been in this scrutiny after truth, I am not ignorant, but to what purpose I know not. For being partial judges of ourselves, we lay a partial estimate upon our own productions. I therefore offer up this book to your lordships, not favour but censure first, as having found by many experiments, that it is not the credit of the author, nor the newness of the work, nor yet the ornaments of the style, but only the weight of reason, which recommends any opinion to your lordship's favour and approbation. If it fortune to please, that is to say, if it be sound, if it be useful, if it be not vulgar, I humbly offer it to your lordship, as both my glory and my protection. But if in anything I have erred, your lordship will yet accept it as a testimony of my gratitude, that the means of study which I enjoyed by your lordship's goodness, I have employed to the procurement of your lordship's favour. The God of heaven crown your lordship with length of days in this earthly station, and in the heavenly Jerusalem with a crown of glory. Your honour's most humble and most devoted servant, Thomas Hobbes. End of section 1. Recording by Jeffrey Church.